People often believe they can escape the consequences of their actions, but the truth has a way of catching up to them. My wife Stella was no exception. She always had a perfect alibi, and I had never found any solid reason to question her loyalty. But one minor detail slipped through the cracks, and that was enough to unravel everything. It's strange how the smallest things can expose the flaws in a relationship. The first warning sign came one night, when I noticed the back of Stella's neck was damp. I had never paid particular attention to this before, but as she climbed into bed, I instinctively reached out to embrace her. My hand brushed against the moisture, and an unsettling thought crossed my mind. Why is her neck wet? That evening, she had attended one of her monthly extended library board meetings. I'd been waiting for her, hoping we could share a quiet evening together. It had been a week since we'd been intimate, and I was looking forward to closing that gap. But the moment I felt the dampness on her neck, I knew something was off. She was hiding something. Stella, at 28, wasn't conventionally beautiful, but her figure turned heads, and her intelligence and wit had always captivated me. She worked as an environmental biologist for the state, while I, Caleb, a 30-year-old civil engineer, had a steady job at a consulting firm. Life was comfortable. We had bought a cozy 3-bedroom bungalow in the suburbs a year ago and seemed to have a promising future ahead. We met through work, and our connection was instant. 6 months into dating, we were deeply in love, both emotionally and physically fulfilled, and decided to get engaged. Our wedding day was a beautiful ceremony with family and friends, where we vowed to be faithful, respect each other, and build a future together. Just a week ago, Stella had stopped taking her birth control pills. We had agreed it was time to start trying for a baby. She was in her most fertile phase, and I had been excited about this new chapter in our lives. But now, doubt had crept in. A year earlier, shortly after we moved into the neighborhood, Stella became friends with Athena, our neighbor, a divorced woman around Stella's age. They grew close quickly, often going shopping or catching a movie together. I didn't mind. I trusted Stella completely and had no reason to suspect anything untoward. It was Athena who introduced Stella to the local library board. At first, the meetings were short and infrequent, but a couple of months ago, they started happening twice a month and stretched to about 4 hours each time. Stella explained they were working on implementing a new interactive computer system for the library, and since she was good with technology, the head librarian often asked for her help after the meetings. It sounded plausible, and I hadn't thought twice about it. But as these meetings grew longer, Stella began to act differently. She seemed tense and withdrawn afterward. When I asked her about it, she blamed the head librarian, describing them as difficult and high maintenance. I let it go, not wanting to add to her stress. Then came that night, the wet hair. It wasn't just the moisture that bothered me, it was the scent. As I leaned closer, I caught a faint whiff of soap that wasn't ours. It wasn't the scent of our shampoo or any product in our home. It reminded me of motels. My suspicions began to grow. As I grappled with these thoughts, Stella rolled over, pulling the blanket snug around herself. "Not tonight, honey," she murmured, her voice heavy with exhaustion. The meeting ran late and I'm wiped out. We both have work in the morning. I swallowed my unease and tried to sound calm. "All right, sweetheart, get some rest." But inside, I felt a gnawing sense of unease. We had just started trying for a baby, something we had been planning for years. Why was she avoiding intimacy? This wasn't the first time she had come back from these meetings distant and evasive, using exhaustion as a shield. A troubling pattern was emerging, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. The question haunted me. Why would she cheat? We'd been married for 5 years and delayed starting a family for financial reasons. With my recent promotion and Stella's decision to stop birth control, the timing felt perfect. But what if my instincts were right? What if she was being unfaithful? The thought of her becoming pregnant with someone else's child was unbearable. Would I end up trapped, paying for a betrayal I couldn't forgive? I spent the entire night lying awake, grappling with the weight of my suspicions. Confronting Stella outright felt reckless without solid proof. If I accused her with nothing more than a hunch, she'd deny everything, leaving me looking paranoid and insecure. I needed evidence, irrefutable evidence, and a plan to protect myself. For now, intimacy was off the table. If she was pregnant by someone else, she might attempt to initiate intimacy soon to cover her tracks. A plan started to take shape in my mind. If she had been unfaithful, she might act quickly to mask her betrayal. A sudden business trip seemed like the perfect excuse to distance myself and buy time. My trips typically lasted a week, enough time for me to dig deeper into this mess. But who was the other man? How long had this affair been going on? Where were they meeting? If her library board meetings were the cover, the man was likely someone connected to the board. Unable to wait, I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Stella, and headed downstairs. Her purse sat on the counter. My hands trembled as I rifled through its contents. Her credit cards were there, but then I spotted one I didn't recognize. It bore her maiden name, Stella Lawrence, and belonged to a bank we had no accounts with. Why would she keep this? Digging further, I found something more incriminating. A business card. The name printed on it. William Wilde, head librarian. William, a man. Stella had never mentioned the head librarian was male. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Fuming, I grabbed her phone and scrolled through her call logs. William's number appeared repeatedly. There were no text messages, which only confirmed my suspicion. They were communicating verbally. My heart pounded as I put her phone back and turned my attention to our shared computer. On the desktop, I found an encrypted email folder. It took some effort, but I bypassed her security settings. What I uncovered froze me in place. Dozens of messages between Stella and William, dating back to when the extended board meetings began. Their emails were explicit, filled with details about their rendezvous at the Red Roof Inn near the interstate. The things she described, she had never done with me. They mocked both me and his wife in their exchanges, all while professing their love for each other. The betrayal cut deep. I copied the emails to a separate folder and made a mental note to print them later. Feeling hollow, I climbed the stairs, packed my suitcase in silence, and decided on an impromptu business trip. By 5:30 a.m., I was ready to leave. Stella stirred as I walked into the bedroom, dressed and ready. "Why are you up so early, Caleb?" she asked groggily. "What's going on?" "I have a flight to catch," I said, feigning calm. "Work called last night. They need me to oversee some projects. I'll grab breakfast at the airport." She sat up, her confusion evident. "How can I reach you if I need to?" "Call my cell," I replied, planting a quick kiss on her cheek, before heading downstairs with my bags. As I opened the garage door, her voice trailed after me. "Caleb, what about starting a family? We were supposed to discuss it this weekend." "We'll talk next month, Stella," I said firmly. "I'll call you when I get to my first stop." Before she could say anything else, I slid into the car and pulled out of the driveway. In the rearview mirror, I saw her silhouette, her shoulders shaking with sobs. I didn't stop. My phone stayed off as I merged onto the interstate, driving far from everything. 2 hours later, I pulled into my dad's lakeside retirement home. The quiet countryside offered a much-needed reprieve. My father wasn't expecting me, but his reaction was the same as always. He greeted me with warmth and began preparing breakfast. Over coffee and omelets, I told him everything. My dad, a widower, had always seen Stella as the daughter he never had. The news crushed him. "I can't wrap my head around this, son," he said, his voice heavy with disbelief. "Your mother and I had a strong bond. As far as I know, she never strayed. You need to approach this carefully. Don't rush into anything." "I know, Dad," I replied, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "I'll head back tomorrow to meet with Tim Gordon, my lawyer. I need to weigh my legal options before taking the next step." Dad nodded approvingly. "Tim's a good man. We've trusted him for years." A small smile crossed my face. "Thanks, Dad, and by the way, your coffee is still the best. The omelets, unbeatable." For the first time that day, I felt a sliver of comfort in his presence. My dad chuckled, his usual warmth breaking through the tension. "Well, if you start cooking more often, you might catch up to my level one day." "Noted," I said with a smile, though the weight of the situation still pressed heavily on my shoulders. At 9 a.m., I called my boss to check in. We agreed on a cover story in case Stella tried to contact me through the office. They'd say I was on the road and could only be reached on my cell. He even prepped the receptionist to back up the story and approved my request for a week off without hesitation. When I checked my phone, I saw 4 missed calls from Stella, each more urgent than the last. I let her stew until noon before calling her back. The tension in her voice was palpable. "Where are you, honey? Can I fly out to spend the weekend with you?" she asked, her tone strained. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," I said casually. "I'll be moving around a lot this week and won't have a set base. Let's plan something for next month, okay? Gotta run. The team needs me." She hesitated. "I love you." I didn't respond. Instead, I hung up, letting the silence hang. My dad overheard the exchange, his face a mix of sadness and disappointment, but he didn't say a word. The next morning, I met with Tim Gordon, my lawyer. After some pleasantries, we got straight to business. "Tim," I said, "Stella's cheating on me. I need to know my options." For the next half hour, he outlined the possible courses of action. Filing for divorce under irreconcilable differences would be the easiest and quickest route. Filing based on adultery, however, would require solid evidence, which could be costly to gather and difficult to prove in court. Since we had no kids and Stella had a stable job, the divorce would likely result in a straightforward 50-50ths split. When I asked about the possibility of her being pregnant by someone else, Tim reassured me that I wouldn't be held responsible for child support. Feeling slightly lighter after our conversation, I thanked Tim and promised to get back to him with my final decision. But my day was far from over. I drove to the library and wandered through the building until I spotted the door marked Head Librarian. Grabbing a random magazine, I settled into a chair nearby and watched. About 30 minutes later, a man around my age stepped out. He was unremarkable, plain, average. I couldn't fathom what Stella saw in him that was worth risking everything we had. Leaving the library, I headed to an electronics store and purchased a voice-activated recorder. Then I checked into the Red Roof Inn, the very place where Stella and William had been meeting. I booked a room for the night, then returned home briefly to check our computer. Her emails revealed something new. She and William were worried about a possible pregnancy. It was clear she hadn't been with me recently, and they were panicking over the timing. Seeing their unease gave me a small, bitter sense of satisfaction. I copied the emails to my own files before heading back to the motel. Later, in the dimly lit motel room, I tried to distract myself with TV, but my mind kept returning to the same questions. Why had she done this? We had a good life, a solid relationship. We had been planning a future. Kids, retirement, a shared life. Sure, our marriage wasn't as passionate as it had been in the early years, but it was far from falling apart, or so I had thought. Her reaction to my sudden business trip nagged at me. Was she carrying William's child? Had she already chosen him over me? It felt like I was seeing a side of her I'd never known, a darker, selfish side, like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. As I lay there, memories of the past 5 years came flooding back. What I had once seen as happy years now felt tainted, wasted. Even if she hadn't gotten pregnant, the betrayal was too deep. I knew forgiveness wasn't an option. Divorce was inevitable. But before I could take that step, I needed to confront her, and that wasn't something I was looking forward to. At 2 a.m., I made a call to our home. Stella answered, her voice shaky, as though she had been crying. "You sound off, sweetheart. Are you okay?" I asked, feigning concern. "Caleb, I just want you to come home," she said, her tone desperate. "I'll try to be back soon, maybe talk to Athena. She might cheer you up," I replied, dropping a deliberate hint. I suspected Athena knew more about the affair than she'd let on. "Okay, honey, I love you. I'll see you soon, sweetheart. Bye." I made sure not to return the sentiment. Later that night, I visited the motel office. To my relief, the desk clerk was a young guy, not someone likely to ask too many questions. After some small talk and a $100 bribe, he agreed to check the motel's records. I gave him Stella's maiden name and the approximate dates of her meetings. They had likely used her old credit card to avoid detection. He promised to have the list ready by morning. I barely slept that night, and at dawn, I was at the desk. As expected, the clerk handed me a detailed list of Stella and William's stays, each one coinciding with her so-called library board meetings. My worst fears were confirmed. When I showed the young clerk at the motel a picture of Stella, recognition flashed in his eyes. He confirmed she had checked in using her credit card and noted that she was discreet but regular in her visits. He even mentioned they only stayed for about an hour each time, leaving separately in their cars. "It's not unusual," he said with a shrug, as though unfaithful spouses were just another part of his routine. After grabbing a quick breakfast, I drove back to my dad's house. The rest of the week passed in a haze of fishing trips and quiet moments by the lake. On Thursday, I called Tim Gordon to let him know I was ready to move forward with the divorce. He promised to have the paperwork ready in a few days. Each night I called Stella, keeping up the pretense of being on a business trip. Her voice grew more strained and desperate with every call. A flicker of pity surfaced in me, but it was quickly overshadowed by the bitterness of her betrayal. By Friday afternoon, I returned home while Stella was still at work. From her emails, it seemed the affair was unraveling. Fears of a possible pregnancy had strained their relationship. With more than enough evidence already, I decided to return the recording device for a refund. I no longer needed it. Sitting at my desk, I printed 2 copies of the email exchanges. William's wife deserved to know what had been happening. As for Stella, I hadn't yet decided when to confront her, right away or after she confirmed whether she was pregnant. When she came home that evening, she practically flung herself at me, wrapping me in a tight hug. Tears streamed down her face as she sobbed, "Caleb, I've missed you so much." I forced a light tone. "What's going on, darling? Did the sink clog up again?" She shook her head, clutching me tighter. "No, I've realized how much I love you. I've missed you more than I can say. After dinner, I want us to finally make that plan we've been talking about happen." Feigning casualness, I replied, "If that's what you want, maybe I should leave more often." "No, don't say that. Don't ever leave me again," she pleaded. "All right," I said, smiling faintly. "Let's have dinner first, then we'll head upstairs for some quality time." Her face lit up with relief. "That sounds perfect." We ate at a nearby restaurant before rushing home. Stella was practically sprinting up the stairs, her excitement palpable. By the time I joined her, she was already on the bed looking at me with anticipation. "Hurry up, dear, I'm ready," she said, breathless. Taking my time, I folded my clothes deliberately, unable to shake the dark thoughts swirling in my mind. Looking at her, I felt a strange mix of loss and anger. She had been mine, always mine, and now that bond felt irreparably broken. I kissed her lightly, masking my true feelings. She responded eagerly, mimicking the acts she had described in her emails with William. It was clear she was trying to win me back, to erase my doubts, but instead of rekindling anything, it only deepened my resolve. I decided to do something cruel. Just as things were reaching their peak, I abruptly stopped and pulled away. "Caleb, what are you doing?" she asked, her voice laced with confusion. "What's wrong?" Sitting on the edge of the bed, I finally said what I'd been holding back. "Stella, we need to talk. I can't keep going because I can't get the image of you with William out of my head." Her breath hitched, and her face twisted in horror. "What are you talking about?" "It's over," I said quietly. "I'm filing for divorce." She bolted from the bed and ran to the bathroom. Moments later, the sound of her vomiting echoed through the house. When the retching stopped, I peeked in. She was crumpled on the floor, sobbing into her hands. I didn't offer comfort. Instead, I went to the guest bathroom, took a long shower, and changed into clean clothes. Downstairs, I poured myself a stiff drink and waited. I knew she'd come down eventually, hoping to salvage something from the wreckage of our marriage. But I was already certain there was nothing left to save. The room was dim, illuminated only by the soft light from the kitchen. I sipped my drink, thinking about what lay ahead. I was still young and had time to rebuild my life, create the family I'd always wanted. But an ache of emptiness lingered, a shadow of the betrayal I couldn't shake. After some time, I heard her hesitant footsteps descending the stairs. She entered the living room, wrapped in a bathrobe, her face streaked with tears. Sitting across from me, she looked utterly defeated. I reached over and flipped on a lamp. "Are you ready to talk now?" I asked, my voice calm and measured. "Are you ready to tell me why you did it?" She swallowed hard, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes. I don't know why I did it, Caleb. I swear, after the first time, I told myself it wouldn't happen again. It all started so innocently, just drinks after the meetings. But you know how I get after a few drinks. It felt tempting, exciting. And after that, it just got easier." She broke eye contact, staring at the floor. I think listening to Athena talk about cheating on her ex-husband made me curious. I should have known better, but I didn't stop. I don't know why I didn't stop. Her voice cracked with regret, but I didn't respond. I just sat there, silently weighing the depth of her betrayal. "Why did you do it the first time?" I asked, my voice tight with controlled frustration. Was there something about loyalty and trust in our conversations before marriage that you didn't understand? Or maybe the vows we made, the ones where we promised to forsake all others, were unclear? If you didn't agree with those commitments, Stella, why didn't you tell me back then? I sighed deeply, the weight of the last 5 years pressing down on me. I've given you 5 years of my life, Stella. 5 years. And now I'm the one who has to start over, searching for someone who actually values fidelity in a marriage. Her hands trembled as she looked at me, her eyes glistening with tears. Caleb, can't we work this out? I love you. I don't want to lose you. I still want to have children with you. I shook my head, keeping my composure despite the anger bubbling underneath. Let's get one thing straight, I said coldly. You lost the right to call me honey, or any of those other sweet names the moment you climbed into bed with him. Do you understand me? Her wide, tear-filled eyes stared back at me, as if she was still in denial, despite everything I'd said. My patience was wearing thin, but I refused to let my anger take control. I would confront her on my terms, not hers. Speaking of children, I continued, my tone sharper now, when exactly do you plan on confirming whether or not you're pregnant? Her face drained of color for the second time that night. She stared at me in shock, her lips trembling. Oh my God, she whispered, barely audible. Yes, Stella, I know, I said, my voice cutting through the silence. And do you want to know why I faked that business trip? To make you feel a fraction of the pain I've been feeling. That's why I'm pushing for a divorce. You plan to conceive a child with your lover and then have me unknowingly raise it as my own. You wanted to manipulate me into covering for his mistakes. She opened her mouth to speak, but I cut her off. That's not going to happen, Stella. What you did is one of the worst things a wife can do to her husband. It showed complete disrespect, not just for me, but for our marriage. There's no coming back from that. Even if it hadn't gone this far, maybe, just maybe, I could have considered forgiving you. But you didn't stop. You kept meeting him over and over again. That's something I can never forgive. Therapy won't fix this. Nothing will. I paused, giving her a chance to respond. Do you have anything to say for yourself? Her voice was barely a whisper. I'm so sorry, Caleb, she said, her tears falling freely. Well, that's settled then, I said, my tone flat. I've already spoken to Tim Gordon. The divorce papers will be ready by Monday. We'll split everything 50-50ths. There won't be any alimony. And if you are pregnant, I won't be paying child support. It's not my child. Are you okay with that arrangement? She nodded, her voice shaky. It seems fair. I'll consult a lawyer before I agree, but it seems fair. Good, I replied, standing up. I'll be sleeping in the spare room until this is finalized. In the meantime, I'll start looking for an apartment. You can stay here and entertain whoever you like once I'm gone. It's over with William, she muttered, staring at the floor. I gathered that from the emails, I said bitterly. It's a shame you didn't end it sooner. Her head snapped up. You read our emails? Yes, I replied, meeting her gaze without flinching. And I made copies, along with the dates and times of your meetings at the Red Roof Inn. I'll be taking those to William's wife tomorrow. She deserves to know what's been happening. 13 meetings, Stella. You used a credit card with your maiden name. How convenient. Makes me wonder how many other affairs you've had before William. Her face crumpled as I continued. His wife needs to know the truth. And if you're pregnant, William can deal with the consequences. That's between the two of you. Do you have to bring him into this? She pleaded, her voice breaking. He has kids, Caleb. Having kids doesn't absolve him of his actions. I might even consider filing an alienation of affection lawsuit against him. Please don't do that, she begged, her desperation evident. We'll see, I said curtly. Anything else? She hesitated, gathering herself. Tomorrow I'm going to tell your parents and your brother the truth. I don't want you spinning some story that paints me as the only villain here. And if you're pregnant, I'll make sure your colleagues and friends know what you've done to me. Tears streamed down her face as she finished. I didn't respond. Instead, I stood up and left the room, heading upstairs to the spare bedroom. As I lay in bed, the sound of her sobbing echoed faintly through the house, but I felt no sympathy. She was alone now, left to face the wreckage she had created. The next morning, I slipped out of the house quietly, leaving before Stella had a chance to wake up. She'd likely cried herself to sleep after our confrontation, and I preferred to avoid any more emotional displays. I gathered the emails and motel records, knowing I'd need them for the difficult conversations ahead. Breakfast at a small cafe felt like the first step toward a new routine, one I'd have to get used to. As I sipped my coffee, I thought about the day ahead. By 7:30, I was on my way to Stella's parents' house, knowing they were early risers and likely already up. When I knocked on their kitchen door, her parents were mid-breakfast. Stella's father waved me in, a welcoming smile on his face. I sat down, and her mother, ever hospitable, poured me a cup of coffee. "Caleb, what brings you here so early? Do you want some breakfast?" her father asked. "No, thank you," I replied. "I already ate. But there's something important I need to discuss with you." Her mother's brow furrowed. "Important? What's wrong?" I didn't sugarcoat it. "I'm divorcing Stella," her mother's hand faltered, sending her coffee cup crashing to the floor. The sound was deafening in the otherwise quiet room. She stared at me, pale and wide-eyed. "Divorce?" she gasped. "Caleb, that can't be true. You two were planning to start a family." "I wish it weren't true, but it is," I said evenly. "Stella has been having an affair for months. There's also a possibility that she's pregnant, and not by me." At that moment, Norman, Stella's younger brother, walked into the kitchen, drawn by the commotion. He caught the tail end of my explanation and froze. "What the hell?" he muttered, looking between me and his parents. The questions came all at once. "Are you sure? How could this happen? Where is Stella? Can't you work things out? Who is the other man?" I did my best to address the barrage of inquiries. "Yes, I'm certain. I have proof, emails, and motel records. Stella confessed everything to me. She's probably still at home right now, unless she's staying with her friend Athena. But this isn't something I can forgive. She tried to get pregnant by him and pass the child off as mine. That's not something I can live with." "Who's the other man?" her father asked, his voice trembling. "William Wilde," I said. "The head librarian. He's married and has kids of his own." Her mother shot out of her seat, heading for the phone. "I need to speak to her. I can't believe my daughter would do something like this." "You should call her," I said, standing to leave. "She'll need your support, but don't try to soften this for her. She needs to face the consequences of what she's done. She's broken two families, not just ours." As I turned to go, her father took my hand. His eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I'm so sorry, Caleb." I don't know what to say. I squeezed his hand gently, feeling a pang of regret. I genuinely liked her family, and it hurt to see them dragged into this mess. But there was no easy way to handle this. I left their house feeling the weight of what was to come. My next stop was William Wilde's house. Parking in front of their modest bungalow, I approached the door with a packet of evidence in hand. When I rang the bell, it was William himself who answered, his face streaked with tears. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice shaky. "I need to speak with your wife and give her something," I said coolly. "She's not available," he replied quickly, stepping in front of the door. "You can give whatever you have to me. I'll make sure she gets it." I stepped forward, my tone hardening. "I know you know who I am and why I'm here, William. You can't stop me from speaking to your wife. If you refuse to let me see her, I'll consider legal action against you for alienation of affection." He flinched at my words, his resolve visibly wavering. William hesitated, his expression a mix of anger and defeat. After a long pause, he sighed and called out, "Meggie, someone's here to see you." He turned back to me, glaring. "You bastard!" "No, William," I said evenly. "You're the one who broke your vows and destroyed my marriage. I'm just here to make sure the truth catches up with you." A woman appeared in the doorway, confusion etched across her face. "What's going on?" Meggie asked, her gaze bouncing between us. "Mrs. Wilde, I'm sorry to bring this to your doorstep," I began, my tone steady but firm. "Your husband has been having an affair with my wife for several months. I'm in the process of filing for divorce, and I have evidence to back up my claims." I handed her the packet of documents. "These are copies of their email exchanges and records of their meetings at a motel." As she flipped through the papers, I watched the realization dawn on her face. The color drained from her cheeks, her hands trembling as she processed what I had just said. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Is this true?" "You can ask your husband," I said, stepping back slightly. He's right here. Maggie turned to William, her eyes full of hurt and disbelief. He broke down immediately, his voice cracking as he confessed. "I'm so sorry, Maggie. I never meant for this to happen. I'm sorry." Her face turned ashen, and for a moment I saw the weight of her devastation. I felt a pang of guilt for being the bearer of such painful news, but I reminded myself that the responsibility lay with him. "I'm sorry for your pain, Mrs. Wilde," I said softly. "I know how devastating this is. I also feel for you and your children. Unfortunately, you should be aware that my wife may be pregnant with your husband's child." The shock in her expression deepened. I handed her the packet. "Use the information however you see fit. I'm truly sorry for what you're going through." Without waiting for her response, I turned and left, unable to endure her heartbreak any longer. I wanted to protect her from the hurt, but there was no way to shield her from the truth. When I returned home, the house was empty. Stella was gone, but I didn't care where she had gone or when she would return. Once I would have worried about her safety or felt incomplete without her, but now I was numb. Indifference had replaced every shred of concern I once held. Needing a distraction, I changed into old clothes and mowed the lawn. The monotonous hum of the mower provided a strange sense of relief, drowning out my thoughts for a while. The fallout of Stella's actions extended far beyond us. Despite her family's objections, she decided to terminate the pregnancy. The decision drove a wedge between her and her parents, who have been distant from her ever since. As for me, the divorce was finalized soon after, on the terms I had set. No alimony and a straightforward 50/50ths division of assets. Now I'm single, but rebuilding my life hasn't been easy. Trust is a difficult thing to regain, and I've found myself grappling with its absence. Therapy has become a regular part of my life, along with studying psychological dynamics to understand how things went so wrong. It's a work in progress, but I'm determined to learn from my mistakes and approach future relationships with caution. 2 years after the divorce, I stumbled upon another opportunity to ensure Stella faced the consequences of her actions. I learned she had gotten engaged again. Reaching out to her fiancé, I shared the details of our marriage and the betrayal that ended it. Not long after, the engagement was called off. It felt like a small but meaningful victory. I've even considered keeping tabs on her, just to ensure any future partners know the truth before committing. As for William and Maggie, they stayed together. From what I've heard, Maggie keeps a tight leash on him, unwilling to let him stray again. Their children likely played a role in their decision to stay married. In some ways, I'm relieved that I discovered Stella's betrayal before we started a family of our own. It's a harsh reality, but I'd rather face this alone than see innocent children caught in the crossfire of her choices. Life has a way of moving on, even after the worst heartbreak. While I still have a long way to go, I hold on to the hope that one day, I'll find someone who truly values loyalty. Someone who can help me rebuild the trust that Stella shattered. Until then, I'm focusing on becoming the best version of myself.